The day-to-day struggles actually faced by most trans people are shared across the working class. For example, struggles for the provision of healthcare, housing, or for security in work. Whilst being trans can make these struggles more difficult or complicated, the truth is that we have lots in common with our non-trans comrades and stand to gain much more when we act in solidarity with each other. Transliberation is not a distraction from the real struggle for socialism. The experience of trans people and other minorities can teach us about how capitalism impacts all of our lives, as well as guiding us when we imagine the kind of socialist world we want to build. What are some of the key material struggles faced by trans people right now? What organising is happening within trans communities, and how can we all show solidarity to stand together in the fight for socialism? To discuss all this and more this evening, I'm very excited to be joined by a bumper lineup of 8 fantastic organisers and allies, trans organisers and allies fighting to improve the material conditions of trans people right now. From healthcare to youth work, to struggles against racism and within the criminal justice system, to demands being made by trans organisers within Momentum and the Labour Party, the speakers this evening span a really broad range. We're going to try and wrap up by 7:30 p.m. So whilst we won't be going into loads of depth with any of the individual speakers, we kind of want you to think of this as a smorgasbord of transliberation, introducing lots of different sites of struggle and providing ways that you can follow up with them afterwards. Just a bit of housekeeping. The speakers are going to talk one after the other. And whilst they're speaking, if you have any questions for them, just write them in the Q&A box. And I'll do my best to put them to the speakers, but sorry if we don't have time because we've got a lot to get on with. Cool, without further ado, let's go to our first speaker, Tor Robinson, one of the founders of Labour Campaign for Trans Rights. Thanks so much for joining us, Tor. I mentioned in my introduction that transliberation should be considered part of the broader class struggle. Can you talk to us more about why you think this is important and what can trans people and allies within the Labour Party be doing at the moment to advance transliberation?
Hi, yeah. So first I'll just apologize. I don't have a working webcam, but yeah, you'll still be able to hear my slightly disembodied voice. So yeah, I think, I mean, my work in the Labour Party is built a lot around trying to center transliberation in the class struggle. And I think the best way to understand this is really just to look at the I think most immediate demands that trans people have, which the trouble we're in at the moment is that after several years of this kind of GRA consultation and process, every other concern has been kind of pushed to the side, just because this becomes such a media frenzy. But the real concerns that trans people have are based around healthcare and housing and employment. Those are sort of the immediate problems that most trans people face in their lives right now. And so the key demands that we really have are for access to universal healthcare and safe housing and secure employment. And there is a movement that exists for those things, and it's the movement for socialism, and it's the workers' movement. I think there's a few ways to kind of understand why the struggles for these things are kind of so central, and why the class struggle is so key to transliberation, and why transliberation is key to the class struggle. So I'll kind of take the example here of healthcare first, where obviously we have the NHS in Britain, which is a great thing, but we know that the NHS doesn't really provide the universal healthcare that it once did, and doesn't provide it at a quality that it's meant to. Transgender people basically don't have universal healthcare in Britain. We can't access transition-related healthcare from the NHS without waiting like 2 to 5 years. I think it's even going to 6 years in some places, which, you know, in any other situation would be an absurd length of time to wait for an appointment. And that makes private healthcare a necessity if people can afford it. Otherwise, people have to self-medicate, which is, you know, quite risky. And so, you know, you can see there that trans people don't have universal healthcare, and so that demand is still active for us. And then you obviously have to ask why is the wait so long, and why do we not have access to this universal healthcare? And it's exactly the same reason why waiting lists are so long for everything else, and why the NHS is under such pressure at the moment, which is because of NHS cuts and underfunding and piecemeal privatization. And it's because austerity and decades of neoliberalism has kind of turned public services from like a collective endeavor where, you know, the purpose of the public service was like to enrich everyone's lives. It was to be a service that, you know, improved your life, and turned it into like a you know, this scarce resource that is only ever going to shrink, and that you have to, if there's a collective endeavor around it, it's just to preserve what remains of it and not to use it. And so if you're trying to resolve that problem, this problem that trans people don't actually have transition related healthcare, then you're immediately coming up against neoliberalism and coming up against capitalism. And it's, you know, it's the same with homelessness. Like why have 25% of trans people been homeless? It's because housing is like a commodity now, which increasingly few people can afford. Why do 50% of trans people not feel able to come out of work? It's because we don't have secure jobs anymore. We don't have sufficient labor rights, and we don't have trade union rights which are able to support us. So I think just looking at these immediate demands, you can see that there's a very clear overlap between I mean, not overlap is really the wrong term. Like the demands are the same. You know, these are the demands that trans people have, and these are the demands that socialism makes, and the demands that we make as part of the class struggle. So I always find it very kind of strange when people make this claim that trans people are like another to these demands, that we're, you know, like you often hear it from kind of I guess centrist transphobes and center leftish transphobes, which is that like, oh, like people don't really care about trans people's concerns. We're just a kind of alien body to them, and their real concerns are these issues. When it's like, well, actually, these you know, issues are also our concerns, and they're our primary concerns, really. And I think you can also see how these, I mean, it's the same kind of story with other groups as well. You can see how this process of, you know, slow kind of neoliberalism and austerity and the kind of mindset that comes with it in our public services has equally affected other groups. You know, like disabled people have the same kind of experience of being pushed out of public services and being kind of portrayed in the media as like some kind of like parasite for using public services which are meant to exist for people to use. And I think if you're taking the view that like the only kind of real class struggle is not related to any of these kind of communities who are, you know, at the sharp edge of really class struggle, then it's not real. Then is just absurd, really. But I think to answer your kind of question on what trans people can, or what people in the Labour Party can be doing, what should be doing right now, I think the first and most kind of important thing, or people not necessarily in Labour Party, people in Momentum or on the left, I think the most important thing, the first thing really, is building solidarity, basically. And obviously, I just mentioned how kind of disabled people have been put under pressure by the same kind of processes that have taken place in our system, and I think you see that, you know, many groups are experiencing this thing at the moment, not just I guess kind of working class people in general, but you know, many different communities are also being increasingly losing access to things like universal healthcare and to housing and to employment. I think it's the reason I always emphasize building solidarity is because obviously trans people are a relatively small group. It may not it may not seem like it because of how much we get spoken about in the press, but we are a relatively small group. But I don't necessarily think that makes us, a weaker group. I think if we can build solidarity with other groups, then our strength is multiplied. And I think that the left and socialism in general provides a great kind of structure with which to build that solidarity, because we do share these demands, and we do have movements, and a movement that has a legacy of decades and decades of work trying to achieve them. And I think that creates a shared understanding and a kind of immediate way to connect through these issues and to kind of build a united movement. And I think that if there's a useful purpose in the Labour Party, then that's really what it is. It's as a space to build connections between these groups. But I also say that you can do the same in trade unions and in many other types of groups, where you can kind of build this solidarity and work to organize. So yeah.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Tor. Really appreciate you joining us. And I think those are some really great insights that sort of set up some of the discussions we're going to be having throughout the evening. You can find out more about Labour Campaign for Trans Rights and how you can support them by checking out their website. We'll post a link for that in the chat now. I want to move on to our next speaker just to make sure we have time to fit everything in. So thanks so much again for joining us, Tor. Next, I'm really excited to be joined by Finn Gregg, who is Director of Youth and Community Services at Gendered Intelligence. It's great to have you on the call, Finn. Thanks so much for joining us. Can you talk to us about some of the real issues that affect trans young people, rather than some of the harmful stereotypes that we see in the media, and how the work you do with them aims to empower and create positive spaces?
Hi, can you hear me? Just checking this is our sound check, isn't it? So good. So thanks for having me. My name is Finn the Human, or Finn Gregg. Some people know me as Finn the Human in my youth spaces. I just wanted to say a little bit about sort of who I am and our organisation, and talk about some of the work we do with our communities and young people. I identify as a queer trans person. When I was younger, the vocabulary that was given to me mostly by cis people, i.e. non-trans people, was of gender binary, and non-binary wasn't really a thing when I was younger. But for sure now, for me, not identifying as a man is super important, but identifying as a trans person first and foremost. I was assigned female at birth, and sort of growing up, there wasn't even support really in that I knew of for lesbian and gay kids, for gender non-conforming kids, etc. So one of the things that I'm most passionate about in my life is creating space for young trans people. And I think when we talk about trans people, when we're thinking about solidarity and when we're thinking about trans people's rights, we often talk about trans people kind of as a block, and we don't think about nuances of what it might mean to be a young trans person, a trans child in today's society. The media don't forget about us, that's for sure. They certainly pick on us left, right and centre as an organisation who work with young trans people, but also picking apart what it means to be a trans child in this world is something that they like to do on a regular basis. But I think when we're thinking about solidarity and we're thinking about kind of wider causes, we can't forget children, we can't forget our young people. So just to say briefly about our organisation, Gendered Intelligence, for those of you who don't know, we started in 2008. Myself and two other people set up Gendered Intelligence, and what we identified at the time was that young trans people were being forgotten in some of the trans movements that were happening, and trans solidarity that was happening, and trans activism that was building, and their needs specifically as young people trying to access information and spaces as well were sort of secondary, or people didn't feel like they had the skills to ask young people to enter those spaces. So we set up to do youth work, basically, and that's what I've been doing for nearly 20 years now. We specialize in working with young trans people and people questioning their gender identity. And the work that we do can't just be in the youth club, as much as I'd love it to be. That's one of my favorite places to be. We have to look at the world around the child. So we do a lot of work with their families. We do a lot of work in schools, supporting the education staff around the child. And we also think broader. So we think about the societies that they might enter into as young people, but also as young adults, like workplaces. And we do training and consultancy for workplaces around trans issues. So that's a little bit about what we do. One of the other things we know is really, really important is young people's mental health. So we do one-to-one services with young people, and we also do trans mentoring in schools to support young people directly in those settings. Just to say a little bit about our youth work, and then move on. We've got youth. We're the biggest trans-only, trans-led and trans-only youth service we believe that we know about. We're not global experts, but for sure in the UK. We have youth groups for 8 to 11-year-olds, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, 18 plus, and also trans femme only spaces, and youth groups for trans young people of colour as well. We're about to set up a specific Black group as well for young trans people, all led by trans adults who are youth work trained, who also have the same identities as the young people in those groups. One of the most important things for us is, and thinking about solidarity, is creating space. So who gets to create space in this world is very political. Who gets to own space in this world, and who gets to inhabit space and have agency over space is super important for us to be thinking about as a movement, I think. So for us to hire spaces and to literally close the doors off to the rest of the world and say to young trans people, come in, you're safe, you're believed, you know, genuinely we're here for you as trans youth workers, is one of the most important things we believe we can do. And the reason for that is that most of those young trans people are navigating worlds where they are the only person that they know who is trans. If you think about most families, they would start from non-trans identified people, and those young trans people are growing up with role models around them who haven't gone through those journeys. So to create spaces where those young people can meet role models, older trans people who are working, but also older young trans people who have gone a path before them, is super important to us. Our demands, I mean to kind of come down to that aspect, I mean, for us, Tor said it correctly, that we get vilified in the media a lot, but actually genuinely trans people want health, healthcare, we want well-being, we want to be believed, and we want to have some space. So in my mind, that's super simplistic. It's not sort of the biggest demands in the world, you know, but actually creating, you know, having space where we can be believed and be cared for and support each other and empower each other is super important, and space to just work on our own well-being. And for us at GI, a lot of that means to have exclusive spaces, so we are on our own for a while, and that is so that we can build our strength and build our solidarity with each other and our empowerment and our knowledge, and then grow from there and come out and join up. We as an organisation are going to be doing a lot of campaigning over the next few months and into next year on healthcare, and also on hate crimes that are happening to trans people. And we just want to flag up that if you want to follow any of our social media handles, we're at Gender Intel, which is kind of a shortened version of Gender Intelligence, and you can find out loads of stuff about the work we do there. And one of our biggest things that we're doing at the moment is partnering with Stonewall and Consortium on a project called Together with Trans. So to find out more about that, it's hashtag Together with Trans, or togetherwithtrans.com, and that's a really cool place to sort of start to think about solidarity. And one of our other resources that we're about to launch is a specific hub, website hub for Black and people of colour who identify as trans and non-binary, for resources and kind of solidarity within the community, so that because we know that trans people of colour, specifically trans women and disabled trans people, are the most affected by the quite frankly absolute crap and nonsense that flies around the world at the moment. So yeah, probably got more I could say, slightly lost myself in my notes, but just to say, let's remember young trans people and remember how much they're getting completely vilified at the moment by a media who's not only misinformed, but I think malintentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Finn. That was incredible. And yeah, please do check out Gendered Intelligence's work. They're a fantastic charity working directly with trans people across the UK. And yeah, I think we posted a link to the specific campaign that Finn mentioned together with Trans in the chat. I did have a question, Finn, from Wafa in the chat, who asked what current policy areas we should be watching and putting pressure on as allies of trans people. I know you sort of mentioned a few broad areas, but maybe you could go into sort of more detail about one of them and how people can show support.
Yeah, I think health and schools would be my health and education would be my core areas. So healthcare is getting dismantled, as we know, nationally, and within that, trans people's healthcare is getting forgotten about, quite frankly. And then with schools, there's been a fair few areas where schools have tried to tokenistically do gender inclusion, but actually with the new relationships and sexual health education policy, there's some threats to that. So I think from my perspective, for young trans people, their healthcare, so healthcare for children, if we're looking at the Tavistock and the support that GPs can give, and then education around kind of sexual health and relationships in schools that has tried to attack trans inclusion education happening in schools recently. So have a look at that policy.
Incredible. Thanks so much, Finn. Cool. I want to move on to our next speaker, who's Vanessa Nwosu from African Rainbow Family. Thanks so much for joining us, Vanessa. Can you tell us a bit about your work supporting trans asylum seekers and some of the broader issues that trans people of colour face within the hostile environment?
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Nwosu. I go by she, her. I'm a member of the African Rainbow Family. The African Rainbow Family is a charity organization that supports asylum seekers or people seeking asylum, especially LGBTQ plus community, and especially people of color. Some of the services we provide are signposting our members to immigration advice and other mainstream services. We also offer free counseling. We support our members with monthly supports in relation to food and phone credits. We offer moral and practical supports to trans people seeking asylum in detention centers. We offer moral support and evidence when it comes to appearing before the court. And I think in our line of work, when offering these services, we have realized several issues facing trans people, especially those seeking asylum. One of the problems is the lack of safe housing. If you know anything about the immigration process, it's the fact that when you claim asylum, most of the time trans people who maybe identify as a woman, they're usually placed in a very hostile environment, maybe not knowingly, but they are placed in a place that has different people with different claims and ideas and beliefs that are different from theirs. We have the story of our member, Kate Hendrickson. I think there's a link. I don't know if it's up there, but then there's a link to her story. She identifies as a trans woman, but she was placed in a housing accommodation. She was placed in a housing accommodation with mostly males. And when she filed a complaint against the assault she was receiving, there was no proper measures taken to help her out of that situation. So I think one of the issues trans people seeking asylum face is lack of safe housing. I know that there are organizations like the Micro Rainbow and then outside projects that exist, but then the number of people who actually need these services, it's more than the actual safe housing present. Another issue that I feel trans people seeking asylum or in general face is the lack of appropriate measures or agencies or organizations that handle and tackle assaults or physical or cases when it comes to physical abuse. In Kate Hendricks' story, she filed complaints against the abuse meted against her, but there was no positive response, even though the Home Office claims to protect people seeking asylum. She was still left in the environment which she complained was very hostile. So I feel we should have more agencies that actually help or that are accessible to trans people seeking asylum when it comes to matters of assault and physical abuse. I think another issue trans people face, and not just people seeking asylum, is mental health support. There are services, but then I don't think most of the services are accessible to the average trans person who is struggling with transition, who is struggling with trying to get by, and also maybe trying to or struggling with their mental health. I think there should be free support with people that do not have these resources, or people that people who lack the appropriate resources when it comes to accessing mental health sessions. I think that's one of the things that African Rainbow Family does. We offer free counseling and free mental health support sessions, but then we only do that when we have the funds to do that. So I think that more people should invest their time and resources, not just resources, just skills also, into organizations that offer all these services in order to help trans people seeking asylum. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. That was fantastic. And like, just to kind of reiterate, African Rainbow Family, an incredible organization doing really good work. Support them in like any way you can. We're going to post a link to their website in the chat now. And yeah, we shared a link to the story that Vanessa was talking about, a Guardian article about the story that Vanessa was talking about as well, so you can read more about that. I want to move on now, but before I do, I just want to take this opportunity to quickly say again that this is part of a programme of trans political education currently being organised by trans people within Momentum, Labour Campaign for Trans Rights and the World Transformed. And we're doing this because we want to make a meaningful intervention on a topic that has become divisive on the left. We believe that political education is an important part of liberation, and to grow stronger, our movement needs good political education at its heart. So that's why we're running this program in our spare time, and we'd love for you to support us. If you're a trans person or an ally interested in helping run the program, then just drop us a line on transpoliticaleducation@gmail.com. Fantastic. Let's move on to our next speaker now. So we want to use this call to give people some knowledge about the different aspects of sort of material struggles that affect trans people, but also want to provide a space to discuss what trans people and allies can do within the Labour Party and Momentum to advance trans liberation. So Paul McGowan is the co-chair of Labour LGBT+ Network. Thanks so much for joining us, Paul. Can you talk about some of the work you've been doing in Liverpool to help build links between local Labour Party groups and groups outside of the traditional Labour movement? What lessons have you learned from this, and how can we take those lessons forward in sort of all the rest of our organising?
Hi, so I'm Paul McGowan. I'm the founder and current national co-chair of the Labour Party LGBT Network, which is basically a grassroots-led group of Labour Party members who have been given a platform for organising campaigns, events, policy forums, sharing speakers between CLPs and organisations nationwide. This basically came from when, in 2018, I became a CLP LGBT officer. That was the first ever one in my CLP, same with Momentum as well at the same time. Roles that I still currently hold, but I found out quickly, along with the other CLP officers in the Liverpool City region, that there wasn't much conversation going on between CLPs, never mind nationwide, between CLPs on that topic. So we basically thought, well, do you know what, if we're going to build a a citywide LGBT officers forum. Once that gets up and going, we might as well start running out to other CLPs in the region and then nationwide if sees fit. But instantly after a couple of weeks of putting out a tweet that we were doing it, started to take off with people from around the country saying, do you know what, this is something we've needed for so long. We've had nothing to empower us to actually go about doing the things we want to do, because at a CLP level at the time, you still had to have minority roles as function officers voted in at a full CLP meeting. And it was the same with LGBT officers, the AME officers and so on. And I know at my CLP it got voted down. We only got the function officer representative roles when the rulebook changed. So what we found was important was to start making connections in the community, such as Liverpool Trans Pride, a grassroots pride organisation that works with other groups. And we've basically took on a founding principle of that we're going to work with every single minority liberation group that's out there that wants to work with us without any caveat, because so often the Labour Party doesn't really reach out to these groups. They'll just wait for them to reach out to them, and then it's whether or not an MP staff member gets back to them in time, whether a councillor responds, or so on and so on. So we decided to start building a network between not just LGBT officers, but the other organisations nationwide. And from that, it took a good while to really start getting outside of Liverpool. So I can only really speak of the early days when in Liverpool, but we were the only group in Liverpool to actually support the first ever Liverpool Trans Pride, despite trying to getting in contact with other CLPs and stuff. No one turned up for the first Trans Pride march. We were the only banner, apart from Wallasey CLP from the Wirral, that came over, and from them we've tried to work closely with them other groups. And at the same time, in 2019 it started to take off a little bit more, because let's say the end of 2019, I mean specifically, when the general election happened, and we seen basically the coming resignation of Jeremy Corbyn, because there's no way that it was going to be able to carry on, as sad as that is that he had to step down as leader. But we knew we were going to have to start organising together, not just within the party, but outside, not just the LGBT community, but the LGBT community with the Black community, with the Gypsy, Roman and Traveller communities and so on. So we decided to put together a minority network, basically, for minority groups and communities to stand together in each other's struggles, work together on campaigns, on art projects, on education, to dispel the myths and misunderstandings and prejudices within each other's communities that are sadly there. We even have it within the LGBT community itself, between biphobia, transphobia and so on. So what happened was, after the first couple of months this year, we had Franklin Graham try to come to the country, and we band together with a number of grassroots organisations to basically oppose that. And from there, we started to get a lot more contact nationwide. So luckily from that, with a United We Stand, when we started getting more and more involvement with people, I met a brilliant activist called Chantal Lund, who together with her set up Merseyside BLM Alliance when the summer happened. And from there, that has now progressed into MARE, Merseyside Alliance for Racial Equality. And from there, we've got over 2,000 members in just under a couple of months. And within that group itself, have set up LGBT representation groups, disability ones, mental health ones, and so on. And we've been able to set up like little festivals in the streets as protests, all working together, each other's communities within that, when they're coming together to educate one another. And that is basically the ethos of what the Labour Party LGBT network has been trying to do within the Labour Party is bring together CLPs to speak together. Because while at the moment we have LGBT officers trying to put on events, not always did he get stuff put out. Even within the CLP, it can be a battle to get their events, whether it be political education or a protest, actually put out to the members when there's other more important pressing issues going on, whether it be someone that they think's a good speaker is speaking at the same time, or they'll organise something at the same time to compete with it for whatever reason. And even this call itself, this meeting from Momentum, I don't think was promoted very well by Momentum, sadly, which is a criticism of Momentum itself, with the fact that during the summer we've had the dropping of the GRA, we had silence from the Labour Party, and at the same time, I believe MPs were even disciplined for even speaking out for trans rights, while there's been other things happening in Momentum, such as backing certain candidates that aren't progressive to trans people. And that's just a continuing issue that I'm so glad that we are doing these educational events on political education, start bringing this forwards, because we need to build together our communities, whether it be councillor training, whether it be training elected officers to know their roles, knowing where they can actually speak up so they're not silenced, training for LGBT members, getting them trained up to run for council, knowing what roles they can go for, and empowering them, whether it be within the party or outside, whether it be community activism and so on. Because it is so important at the moment that we as a community come together, not just the LGBT community or the trans community, because I'm a non-binary person, I'm part of the trans community. I know what I know, but I'm still always learning, as everyone else should be. Like, I never claim to know anything that I don't. Like, it's just one of them of, you get asked to speak on things rather than, because I'm explaining this better. It's that everyone's in that learning process, and we need to start bringing that out to the CLPs as a whole, because we are socialists. We should be learning about each other's experiences, our lived in experiences, our communities. We shouldn't just go at it as a place of, we are socialists, so we know equality and we know what we're doing, because clearly with anti-Semitism in the party, transphobia in the party that's not dealt with, likes of MPs making horrible statements, horrible actions, there's anti-GRT racism within the party not dealt with, and it just continues and continues and continues, while whenever anyone calls it out, they will be vilified for daring to speak out against good comrades. And at the same time, you've got the horrible misinformation that the GRA, and when it was brought up, and that no information whatsoever, creating that void of hole for hate groups to then fall into and take that place of pushing misinformation and creating this hostile atmosphere for trans people, whether it be in the Labour Party or the society as a whole, to the point that we now have hate groups coming into the Labour Party. We had LGBT, especially trans people, allegedly attacked a conference last year in Brighton. They had water thrown over them. Nothing was done about that. There's nothing done on the NEC about transphobic motions being pushed. They never get ruled out of order. And it's just a continuing thing. And when society is the way it is, we need to start working together more and more within our communities and start pushing for education, because the only time we've ever really got the chance to do that was when I was personally working with Dawn Butler on a campaign for deputy leader, when she was going to bring in an education programme within the party, the Ian Core, and we were helping the Labour Party LGBT network in putting together like the training packages and stuff, because we were talking about that specific thing, but unfortunately that never came to be. But it is time now for Momentum to start really pushing on this, and I'm so glad that we've got the opportunity to be doing this, and it's why I'm so happy to be part of the World Transforms Trans Political Education Steering Group, because again, it's just one of the, I keep emphasising how important education is, because only by opening your minds And even us as trans people or allies, we always have to open our minds to other people's experiences. Our own single experience isn't the only one. And the more we educate each other, the more people will open their minds, they'll understand what it is that we want to do, whether that be helping as allies MPs to put forward a definition of transphobia for disciplinary cases, whether it's getting MPs to properly sign up to fighting for trans healthcare. Like, we have one of the people that started International Trans Youth Day, Felix Mufti, on our team. And just all these voices within our party, that's why we set up our website, to be that platform for people to write articles, to come on, sign in as members. They can access all resources on the GRA, on trans liberation, access model motions, and just everything. They can publish articles, never taking people's voices away, because it's so important. When we are a minority, there should be united as the majority against the bigots. The people need their voice heard, and that's probably all I've got to say at the moment.
Thank you so much, Paul. I thought that was a really powerful intervention. And yeah, it's really inspiring to hear, first of all, about the work that you've been doing, building solidarity across different groups and mapping common demands. But yeah, also, like, completely agree with you that, yeah, like, as socialists, we need to learn about these things. We're not just born anti-racist or knowing everything about transphobia. And I hope that through this process of political education and these events, we can sort of make a really positive intervention, specifically with trans liberation in this area. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us, Paul. I'm going to move on to our next speaker now, who is Lamble, who is an organizer with Bent Bars Project. Thanks so much for joining us. Could you talk to us about some of the issues that trans people face in prisons and what we can do about it?
Great. It's really great to be part of the conversation, so thanks for inviting me. For those of you who aren't familiar already with the Bent Bars Project, we're a grassroots mutual aid project that provides direct support and solidarity to LGBTQ prisoners in the UK. And we've been running for nearly 12 years, and we mostly run a pen pal scheme for queer and trans prisoners to basically connect our communities across prison walls. So I'm sure that many of you will be aware that queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people have a really long history of being targeted by the criminal justice system in this country and also around the world. But many people may be less aware that this legacy actually continues today. So while many of the kind of more overtly homophobic and transphobic laws have been overturned, we still see patterns where those who face high levels of inequality, discrimination, and marginalization are disproportionately likely to end up in prison. And that includes trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. So to give you an example, and other people have been referencing this as well, is the kind of wider issues that trans young people face, for example, means that they are at greater risk of bullying and harassment, dropping out of school, becoming homeless. Once on the street, they may turn to criminalized survival activities such as sex work or drug trade, or they may self-medicate to cope. And all of those things can put them at higher risk of contact with the police and higher risk of criminalization. And this is often exacerbated for people of color, for migrants, and people with disabilities. So if you're concerned about social justice inequality for trans people, we really need to be concerned also with issues of policing, prison, and criminalization. So in terms of the kinds of issues that trans people face in prison, the first thing that I would want to note is that it's often very difficult for trans people to be open about their identities in prison. And so a lot of people hide their identities or go back in the closet for reasons of safety. And this can have a real impact on people's mental health, and it can also impact their subsequent ability to access healthcare and legal recognition of their identities. Because if you weren't out consistently or for a sufficient period of time, then people are often seen as not legitimate or authentic in their identities. And we already know that trans identities are already routinely under huge amounts of intense scrutiny. So for this reason, you should be wary about the kind of statistics that are often being bandied about in the media about the number of trans people in prison. And Bent Bars has some fact sheets about this if you're interested. In terms of the main issues that trans people face inside prison, they're actually very similar to the issues faced by people outside prison, but they tend to be amplified because you have so little access to community and supports from within prison. So lack of respect of people's identities, lack of adequate health care, discrimination, harassment, bullying and abuse, sexual assault. These are all things that are rife within prison. And sadly, premature death is an issue that we also have to grapple with. So there have been a number of deaths of trans people in prison, particularly trans women, but also trans men. And these are really urgent issues that need to be addressed, but also often people don't want to face them because prisoners are seen as less deserving of support. And we really need to challenge that. So how do we address these issues? I want to outline 4 key strategies, and a lot of them echo what other people have been saying on the call already, which is great. So first, to build trans liberation, we need increased collective awareness about trans issues in the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, as other people have mentioned, there's a huge amount of misinformation in the media, particularly around trans prisoners at the moment, and it makes it really difficult to address some of the issues effectively. And so we really need to build up our collective knowledge and ensure that that knowledge is accurate. Second, as part of trans liberation, we need to support trans people and all criminalized people to survive prison and to get access to the things that they need to survive when they get out of prison, because survival isn't guaranteed. And this means building relationships of care, friendship, and support with people in prison and people getting out of prison. And you can connect with groups that do direct support for prisoners like Bent Bars or the Prisoner Solidarity Network or SOAS detainee support work, who all do this kind of work. But it also means ensuring that prisoners and people coming out of prison can access the supports they need to survive. So whether we're working on issues such as healthcare, housing, education, migrant support, anti-violence work, we need to make sure that our supports, our services, and our campaigns are inclusive of people who have histories of criminalization or are at risk of criminalization. Third, as part of trans liberation, we need to address the underlying issues that funnel trans people into the criminal justice system in the first place. And that means addressing the broader issues of inequality that a lot of people have been discussing, but it also means working to reduce our reliance on prisons and police. And prisons and police don't actually keep us safe. We need to refocus our energies on addressing the root causes of violence and harm, and stop asking the criminal justice system to deal with social problems that it's not equipped to deal with, like poverty, addiction, and mental health. So we need to support campaigns that stop prison expansion, that work to redirect resources away from the police. We need to stop laws that expand punishment and criminalization. So I want to give a potentially controversial example, and that is the current proposals to extend hate crime legislation in England and Wales by making misogyny an aggravating factor for sentencing. Now, on the surface, this might seem like a good idea, but it's actually quite problematic. Now, people tend to think that hate crime legislation is preventative, but that's not how it actually works. Hate crime legislation in this country has 2 main components. One is recording, which can be important, but the other component is simply increasing penalties after the fact. So it's longer prison sentences. Yet there is no evidence that harsher penalties work as an effective deterrent, and no evidence that harsher penalties actually keep us safe. Hate crime legislation instead expands the power of the state to lock people up for longer periods of time. And we know that the prison system doesn't target the people who commit the most harm, but the people who are most vulnerable to criminalization, i.e. people who don't have wealth and privilege to protect them. And if you're interested in reading more about trans feminist critiques about hate crime legislation, I'd encourage you to check out Dean Spade's work. And it's focused on the US, but a lot of the arguments are relevant here. You know, as a feminist, I want to see misogyny confronted, challenged, and addressed, but evidence tells us that criminalization is not an effective way of doing that. So we really need to redirect our energies towards stopping harm in the first place and reducing violence. And I think there's so many amazing resources out there. So if you're interested, check out some of the websites that advocate a transformative justice approach. So groups like transformharm.org or abolitionistfutures.com. And finally, and this is again echoing what other people have said already on the call, is trans liberation requires us to build solidarity across struggles. So trans prison issues are closely linked to other strategies such as housing, healthcare, homelessness, education, disability justice, anti-racism, and migrant justice. So in whatever campaigns or social justice work you might be involved in, consider how trans prison issues and criminalization can be addressed and connected within those struggles. So I think I'm probably at time, but just if you're interested in learning more, Bent Bars is about to relaunch our website, and we're going to be releasing some new info sheets on trans prison issues. So if you'd like to get access to them, you can check back on our website in a couple weeks, or you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. There's a link on our contact page. So that's bentbarsproject.org. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lambo. And yeah, Lambo's really helpfully collated a list of some of the organizations in this space you can follow up with, as well as some further reading, that Dean Spade trans feminist critique of hate crime legislation. So we're going to post the links to those in the chat now. I did just want to quickly ask a follow-up question, Lambo, and big question, but if you can sort of try and have like a briefish answer, that'd be great. Because I think that for lots of people, the only time we'll hear about trans prisoners in the way that they're kind of mobilized as a trope in the media. And I just wondered if you could comment on some of the kind of negative media coverage around trans prisoners and how we should respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think the misrepresentations are really distressing, and they're really harmful. You know, there's a lot of sensationalist reporting, a lot of misleading claims, a lot of really decontextualized statistics. And the problem is that these misrepresentations not only kind of harm, like they replicate harmful stereotypes and discriminatory attitudes towards trans people in general, but they also have an impact on people inside prison and can increase patterns of bullying and harassment. So just quickly to give you an example, there's often assumptions in the media that non-trans women don't want to share space with trans women. Yet we know from our experience that many trans women in prison have contacted us and said that non-trans women were supportive of them, were encouraging of them, very welcoming of them. But when you have a media that is constantly saying trans people are dangerous or trans people are sex offenders, then people start to get worried, and it increases the kind of hostilities in prison, and it can undermine attempts at solidarity. And so I think we really need to push back on those media misrepresentations. And again, the Bent Bars info sheets that we've got will hopefully help give people a resource that they can make use of in order to kind of counter some of that and challenge, you know, social media claims and misrepresentation in the media.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was great. And definitely check out those info sheets. Cool. I want to move us on to our next speaker, who is Joseph Funnell, who's an activist with Lesbians and Gay Support the Migrants. Thanks for joining us, Joseph. So LGS Migrants is based on the principles of building solidarity between LGBT plus communities and other marginalized groups. Can you talk to us a bit about what this means in practice, why you think it's an important principle, and maybe some examples of campaigns that people can rally around?
Of course. Thank you for having me, first of all. And yeah, as Fergal just mentioned, I'm going to speak a little bit about building solidarity between LGBT communities and other marginalized groups, and focusing, I guess, a little bit less on the demands of trans asylum seekers, because Vanessa has already sort of covered that. So LGSM, we're an activist group. We focus on fundraising, campaigning, direct action, and direct support. And basically, this idea of solidarity, extending solidarity beyond our own struggles, is something that we were founded around. We formed in 2015 in a response to what came to be known as the migrant crisis. And basically, the policies that were being put forward by Theresa May at the time in her creation of what we now know as the hostile environment, this being a set of policies that the idea being that making the UK such an intolerable place to be in for migrants and asylum seekers that they will leave voluntarily. This is obviously something that's being extended by Priti Patel, and is only kind of the hostility of the hostile environment is kind of intensifying, sadly. We also kind of formed in response to homo nationalist ideas. So this being the kind of idea that LGBT people are kind of presented as European, and the values of migrants coming from non-European places are a threat to these values. So we were kind of trying to want to counter LGBT identity being utilized by Islamophobes and fascists. We, in the name, we were inspired by the 1980s context of the miners' strike and the group Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners. And we build on a proud history of queer solidarity, saying that no one is illegal. Whilst our name is Lesbians and Gay Support the Migrants, we are a diverse group composed of all different sexualities and gender identities. But that the choice to keep that name is basically a nod to that history of queer solidarity. So our philosophy is about having solidarity with all migrants, so not just queer migrants, but everyone. It's about ending borders, deportations, and the hostile environment. It's about anti-racist work, lifting up voices and centering those with experience of the hostile environment, anti-homo nationalism, as I said, and linking the struggles of queers, migrants, people of color, and workers. So what does that look like in practice? I guess I thought it'd be good to give an example of like a story which covers quite a lot of what we've done with LGSM. It precedes me joining the group, but it continues when to a time when I have been there. So beginning in 2017, we started supporting an asylum seeker, an individual from Nigeria who had been forced, a queer lady who had been forced into marriage, was fleeing domestic violence, and her life was in danger. She had come to the UK and was in the asylum process since 2014. We started supporting her in 2017, but there was an incident in which she was, her NAS accommodation where she was staying was unlawfully raided. She was unlawfully detained and given misinformation to believe that her asylum claim was not valid, and there were attempts made to deport her, even though this was completely unlawful. In the first deportation attempt, she actually attempted to take her life. That halted that, and then they tried to deport her again the following week. So we worked actually in conjunction with Afro Rainbow Family and Women for Refugee Women, and we, on hearing about this potential deportation, started putting pressure on Virgin. We identified the flight that she was going to be on and started putting pressure on the airline to stop this happening. So that was through social media. We went to the airport, we spoke to passengers, we spoke to workers on the flight, letting them know what was happening, and we were also contacting the individual's lawyers through Twitter, because the Home Office carefully planned this deportation to be on a Saturday when they knew that the lawyers would not be in the office. We were able to stop that deportation, and she was not put on the flight. And the good news is that just recently, only after 6 years, so she began her claim in 2014, this individual has now been granted leave to remain, which is an incredible thing. But on the back of this, and seeing that Virgin were very responsive to the pressure and their image kind of being damaged, them seeing themselves as kind of an LGBT friendly organization, we decided to kind of campaign. So we started campaigning for about 6 months, asking them to stop all their deportation flights and their contracts with the Home Office. This included an open letter and a petition that we did with other organizations such as Barack. Virgin actually notified LGSM that they would no longer be taking deportation contracts, which was incredible news, but we kind of had to force them to publicly announce that. And then since then, we've kind of moved our attention onto British Airways, with whom we've experienced a lot more resistance. We've been campaigning, I think, for a couple of years now to get them to do the same. We've been petitioning. We've got about 150,000 signatures. We did a whole campaign called the 100 Letters campaign, where we got different organizations and individuals involved in migrant rights work to send 100 letters to BA. It was kind of riffing on their own 100-year anniversary campaign, where they had celebrities writing like 100 love letters to BA. We've done actions like crashing one of their corporate dinners and handing out information. We did an action at Brighton Pride where BA were a sponsor, and we occupied the I-360, which is like kind of a bit like the London Eye in Brighton, if you're not familiar with it. And we also work with BA staff and their unions who are very sympathetic and don't really want to be doing that work. And recently we did an action outside Twickenham Rugby Stadium because BA are sponsors there. So yeah, we try and work with creative actions, but we also about raising awareness, but also kind of lobbying and providing direct support to migrants in some instances. We are kind of like a reactive group as much as we are proactive as well. So at the moment, we've kind of shifted our focus back towards the coronavirus pandemic and how that is adversely affecting migrants, particularly those with no recourse to public funds, meaning that they aren't eligible for benefits or support. And a lot of migrant centres are having to close because of COVID. So we're about to launch a fundraising initiative, our second one of the year, for our COVID response. This will be for the Unity Project, who works specifically with individuals in no recourse to public funds. And we're also running like a asylum seeker mutual aid group for support on Facebook. So definitely check those out if you are looking to get involved. Why is solidarity and showing solidarity outside of your own struggle important? I was thinking about this, and I was thinking a lot about, I guess, how the legalization of gay marriage in the UK, for example, brought about this kind of sense of homonormalization, and it feels almost as if like certain sectors of the LGBT community, namely kind of white, affluent gays, have began to leave the other groups within that acronym behind. This year we heard about this thing called the LGB Alliance forming, who are basically a group of people wanted to drop and erase trans people from our community, despite trans people and trans people of color being so fundamental to queer liberation in the first place. By the same token, I think about what does our liberation mean as queers, as trans people, if we still have a government who are routinely targeting and deporting people to situations in which they face violence and potentially death on the basis of their gender identity or sexuality. Just to bring in some figures, the Home Office, the figures that they provide, they say 76% of LGBT asylum cases are refused by them, but UK, LGIG and Stonewall did an independent review, and they would estimate that it would actually be closer to 99%. And this is partially due to the fact that the Home Office can take a lot of license in making people prove their sexuality or their gender identity. Can be a very invasive and a very difficult process, and they are I don't know how to say it, but like insensitive is an understatement. I think like questions that for example someone might be asked in an interview if they are seeking asylum based on their sexuality is to name like 10 Kylie Minogue songs, but someone might not. I don't know. Obviously, there's like a whole host of issues there, other than like the kind of base practical fact that someone coming from outside the UK will not even know who Kylie Minogue is, might not know. Also, we think a lot in LGSM about the idea of solidarity versus charity. So solidarity being the idea that we can draw on our own struggles and oppressions and find some resonance in the struggles of others. Obviously, queer history, that we have a history of state oppression, criminalization, persecution. So we are able to acknowledge and see how easily migrants can be scapegoated and targeted in the current climate. For me, it's also about identifying and leveraging my own privilege. I'm queer, I'm black, I'm gender non-conforming, but there are still a whole host of privileges that I have access to, that many of my trans siblings and both here in the UK and abroad may not, largely because of my passport, my education, etc. So yeah, for me, LGSM was a way of thinking about how to utilize my own privilege and the resources that I have. But thinking as I was kind of preparing for this, I was thinking a lot also about a process that we're going under in LGSM at the moment, in terms of we're reviewing and looking inward, partially on the back of like this resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, but how, you know, we can be more inclusive as an organization, and how that extends to people of color and also trans folk. And yeah, whilst I'm here, I think the reality is, if we're talking about extending solidarity beyond our own oppression and beyond our own struggles, a lot of my trans siblings of color, the reality is we're spending so much time and effort to just get by and survive, access the healthcare that we need, access the resources we need, stay employed, that having the energy to really organize beyond that is not often possible. So I think, yeah, as I start to wrap up, I guess one of my notes would be to those of us who are in activist groups to kind of take that into consideration at all points. And I also just wanted to maybe close by reading reading a little letter of a friend of mine, Chava, who used to be part of is part of LGSM, and we were meant to do a talk together at one point, but then she couldn't come, and I mean, I'll let her speak through the words that I'm gonna read, but I think she just kind of hits the nail on the head, really, about what I've kind of been talking about. So I'll just delve into what Harper wrote. Hello everyone, I'm sorry I couldn't be here this evening to talk with you. This was in reference to another talk that we did, but I think it applies to this as well. But I'm very tired. I wanted to talk about why that is, and about liberation. I'm tired because I am a trans woman. I'm tired because I've been fired from 2 jobs for being trans and can barely keep my 3rd one. I'm tired because I don't want to go back to doing sex work where men can hurt me, but will probably have to so I can pay my rent. I'm tired because I have no institutional support for my transition, just support from my sisters and siblings. I'm tired because of the changes that are happening to me, to my body and my feelings. I'm tired because I need to pay for hormones, for laser hair removal, for travel to and from blood tests. I'm tired because of the anxiety of being constantly alert from possible attackers on the street. I'm tired because I can barely sleep. I'm tired because my bank balance is almost always at 0. It seems it's always people like us, trans femmes and trans femmes of colour, who are on the front lines of fighting for liberation, because we have nothing else to lose, and because we understand that the system we're in works far too well, that capitalism is exploitation and death, that borders exist to prop up corrupt and dying nations. It is mostly people who benefit from structural privilege, most specifically white people who are middle and upper class, that can put their unpaid time into doing things like this and then feel good about it. There are some core unchallenged assumptions in LGSM. There seems to be a suggestion in the name that migrants are not lesbian or gay. Migrants are not lesbian or gay or trans or queer or anything like that. There is an assumption that no one in LGSM is a migrant, that none of this overlaps. I don't believe that to be true overall in the organization, but power maintains itself by giving the most privileged people the most space. We can imagine how easy paternalist and insulting ways of thinking can creep in. It amazes me how much the society we're in is trying to kill people like me. The National Transgender Discrimination Survey in 2015 put the number of trans people who have attempted suicide at 41%, which jumps to 64% if they're a victim of assault. It amazes me how much the society we're in is trying to kill migrants, refugees, people of colour who are not lucky enough to be born in the West. I often wonder how far the rest of us may be pushed so that we accept that for many of us it is liberation or death. Liberation from gender, from nations, from borders, from violence, from invented systems of otherness, from capitalism, from enforced suffering. Please, as well as talking and discussing, get involved, organise, join activist groups, prepare for the necessary change that we all need to be. I pray that our liberation comes for ourselves and our siblings across the world.
Thank you so much, Joseph. That was really powerful. And yeah, we've had lots of comments in the chat as you were speaking, lots of like really supportive comments. Just wanted to share this from Claire, not a question, but as a bisexual woman who started political activities during the 84-85 miners' strike, I love the continuity from LGSM, La Luta Continua. So thanks very much. Cool, I really want to move on just to make sure we get the final two speakers in time. And yeah, it's fantastic to have over 150 people from different parts of the labour movement on the call this evening, learning about collective demands we could all be making to support trans people and advance the cause of socialism. So in that spirit, it's really exciting to be joined now by Nadia Whittam, MP for Nottingham East. Nadia, thanks so much for joining us, first of all. We've heard from lots of organisers from groups outside of Parliament on this call. Could you talk us through what you see as the Parliamentary Labour Party's role in sort of supporting and amplifying these struggles?
Thank you so much, Fergal, and thank you for inviting me today. It's a real genuine honour to be sharing a platform with such phenomenal trans activists and allies, from Tor speaking about the class struggle and how that's so intrinsically linked with the struggle for trans liberation and linked to the issues of healthcare and job security, hearing from Finn about young trans people and the basic demands that they have for space, for compassion, just to be believed. From Vanessa, hearing about trans people seeking asylum in the hostile environment, and from Paul on their work in the Labour Party against some very hostile currents. And I was particularly impressed, Paul, with the work that you're doing, that mutual solidarity between organised Gypsy, Roma and Traveller groups, and also your focus on constant learning. Lamble, I thought that your presentation was excellent, and it's really given me a lot to think about the prison system, and I'll definitely consider your view on misogyny as a hate crime and read that transfeminist critique on hate crime legislation that you mentioned. And lastly, Joseph from LGSM, your examples of the very creative direct action that you've been involved in, and the very interconnected and overlapping struggles of LGBTQ rights and migrants' rights, and that inherent violence of our border regime. So thank you to all of you. I'm convinced that in a decade or two, we will look back at this time and we'll find it strange that supporting trans rights was ever seen as controversial and brave, and that it was even a debate amongst people who see themselves as being part of the left. Of course, trans people don't have 10 or 20 years to wait for a cultural shift. You need our solidarity now. And over the past 3 years, we've seen the so-called debate around the Gender Recognition Act has been absolutely toxic. Organised trans groups that are very well funded have thrown a lot of resources into spreading misinformation and spreading prejudice, and elements of the billionaire-owned media have been more than happy to give a minority of very privileged anti-trans voices disproportionate platforms. I can't count how many times I've seen wealthy anti-trans columnists given full-page spreads in newspapers to talk about being silenced, while trans people have pretty much never get comparable platforms. I'm always very frustrated by the way that much of the media covers the topic of trans rights. It covers it as a headline-grabbing, controversial, culture war issue, rather than what it actually is. And that's a human rights issue, it's a class issue, and it's an issue of truth versus misinformation. I can't imagine what it must be like and what it must feel like to endlessly see wealthy cisgender people obsessively debate and police what pronouns you're allowed to use or which toilets you should be using, when you're part of a community, a minority that faces disproportionate poverty, disproportionate unemployment rates, disproportionate rates of homelessness and mental health problems, and often has to wait at least 2 years to access essential healthcare. Why is it that we keep talking about changing rooms and almost never about the fact that 1 in 3 employers openly admit, and these are just the ones that openly admit, that they are less likely to hire a trans person? I want to see more trans people in the media, particularly more Black, Asian, minority ethnic, more working class trans voices, not being invited to debate their right to exist, but to tell their stories and to show themselves as complex human beings, just like anybody else, defined by so much more than just their gender identity. We shouldn't be surprised to see a trans person in public life, but for all that's said about the very slowly improving diversity of Parliament, we still don't have an openly trans member of Parliament. It shouldn't be me here as a cisgender person representing the Parliamentary Labour Party on panels like this, as honoured as I am to join it as an ally, because we should have talented trans socialists in Parliament speaking for themselves. And I hope that one day very soon, I'll see some of the brilliant people on this panel in Parliament alongside me. But until that's a reality, it is important for allies to speak up. We've got to use our privilege and our platforms to dispel myths, to raise awareness, and most importantly, to amplify the demands of trans people. And in particular, we need to resist attempts that we've all seen and have been spoken about on the panel already, to pit oppressed and marginalised groups against each other. For me, as a proud feminist, as a queer woman, I always make it very clear that I see no contradictions between the rights of trans people and the rights of cisgender women and other cisgender queer people. In fact, a lot of the problems that we face are similar. Domestic and sexual violence, which, by the way, we all know that trans people are far more likely to be victims of than perpetrators of. Right to the gender pay gap and discrimination in the workplace, to patriarchal gender norms and stereotypes telling us how we should dress and behave that impact all of us. So in our fight against the patriarchy, our shared fight, cisgender feminists and trans people should be natural allies. So I'd really like the people in the Labour Party who pit those groups against each other to reflect about what they're doing and who they're helping and who they're hurting. And why is it that on the issue of trans rights, some self-described feminists are suddenly finding themselves on the same side as Donald Trump supporters and the far right? Equally, as has already been spoken about so eloquently already, the Labour movement needs to actively stand with trans people and for trans rights, and to centre them and make them a core part of the class struggle. Look, I'm not going to present British working class history through rose-tinted glasses, but British working class people do have a proud history of standing with marginalised communities in parts, and all of us have that shared experience of powerlessness. So from miners and that mutual solidarity with the LGBT community, white working class people in Bradford standing with their Asian neighbours against fascists, we must not allow the elite to divide us, to divide the working class in all of its diversity. And this is something that trade unions should be speaking about. They should be running campaigns aimed at the government, as well as educating their members and giving them the tools to educate others in their workplace and to confront bigotry in our communities. Because as we've already heard today from our brilliant speakers, this is a material struggle. This is about the right to healthcare, the right to housing, about rights and dignity at work. And it's about saving lives. And if we don't stand for trans people and with trans people, we cannot claim to stand for and to stand with the working class.
Thanks so much, Nadia. It was such a great intervention. We really appreciate your solidarity and completely personally echo so many of the things you've been talking about, especially to do with the shared struggles of non-trans and trans women and other trans feminine people against the patriarchy. I think that's such an important point. We are running out of time, but I do really want to put a question to you in the chat from Chloe, which is about, what can we do about addressing transphobia shared openly by Labour representatives? This is in the PLP, but also Labour councillors, and it feels like for ordinary members, there's no way to get our voices heard to challenge that. I know it's a big topic, but if I could ask you to address it quite quickly, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, off the top of my head, and if there's anything else that springs to mind, I'll contact Momentum about this, or the World Transformed, sorry. I think that we should be making our voices heard within Momentum. Pass motions at your CLP, your branch and your trade union branches. Write to the Labour Party and write to your MP if you have a Labour MP.
Cool, thank you so much. And I'm just going to read, this isn't a question, but I'm just going to read out this comment from Heather about, we do have brilliant trans voices in the Labour Party, and they're generally ignored. And in the past, there's been a good degree of tokenism in selection of trans candidates to unwinnable seats. The Labour Party needs to commit to supporting trans candidates to stand in winnable seats at the next election. I think that's a demand that a lot of us on the call could get behind. Thank you again so much, Nadia, for joining us this evening. Really appreciate it. Cool, okay, we're going to move on to our final speaker now, who is Iggy Moon, an organiser with London Intersex and Trans Community Healthcare Hub. Thanks so much for joining us, Iggy.
Can you hear me?
Access to healthcare is one of the key demands for trans liberation. We've heard it mentioned by several other speakers. I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the specific struggles that the trans people face in the healthcare system in a bit more detail, and also the work that you do to support them.
Can you hear me, Fergal?
I can hear you great.
Hi, great. Hi. Well, this is fantastic. I mean, I just think that every single person contributing to this is helping to stop that idea of trans memories being deleted or faded, and that this is exactly the sort of thing that we need. I was a kid of the 1980s, and part of that miners' strike struggle that the lesbian LGBT community fought against. And I remember what it was like to live under the Thatcher regime very, very clearly. And we were in bloody poverty. We had nothing, and we were treated like scum, and the media representation of our lives was such that we were really seen to be worthless. So the idea that people now are able to make a vision come alive through media like this, and to challenge those voices is fantastic. Really, we've lived through some times, and so has the Labour Party. I mean, I was part of the Corbyn voice and Momentum voice, and quite strongly feel that the policies are very progressive and what this country needs. And I also want to say hello from my mum, who's 91, who's a trans ally. And that woman has gone through shit in her life, I'll tell you. She was working in a mill at 14. She has gone through hell and high water. And she wants you to know she's a Labour member, she's a socialist through and through, and she's a trans ally. So I just want everybody to know that, because at 91 takes undoing. Now, look, I I'm the chair of a memorandum of understanding against conversion therapy. And I'm also here representing LICH, the London Intersex and Trans Community Hub, which is a do-it-yourself grassroots group of fantastic trans-binary and non-binary people. We get no funding, we just get on with it. It's a do-it-yourself group. We try and get leaflets out about healthcare and try and educate people. Being on a committee, I also have a slightly different role where I try to negotiate in a different way with people from therapeutic backgrounds about maybe what they can do to bring about an end to conversion therapy. And these are very distinct areas that we do need to feel we can all be involved at a grassroots level or on committees. I also work in higher education, and I teach psychologists, which I'll come to in a minute, and I also teach sociologists. And I think there is something about our education system that really needs a good rattle. It needs to change. We're in a paradigm shift. It really doesn't matter what Andrew Gilligan and the TERFs and whoever else might be stampeding around, hating every trans person from here to eternity. It really, young trans siblings are growing up in a world that they want to reflect a trans life, and they want to feel safe. And it's our duty, it's our business, if you like, to ensure that we do this to help their lives to become safer. They are going to live in a world that we are part of the making of, as Marx would say. It's about the history, it's about the materialism, and it is about these young people having a better life. And regardless of what is said, they are going to live that life in whichever way, like we did in the 80s. We survived and got through everything that was happening. And a lot of people didn't make it along the way, but those of us that did are here to carry on fighting, and so we shall, in the memory of those that we've had to leave behind. Now, in trans healthcare, I am pretty much aware that when I teach psychologists, there's very, very little knowledge that they have around gender. It isn't part of the curriculum. Gender needs to be on the curriculum for both young people, for adolescents and older people. Transition, for 2,000 people that answered the LGBT survey in 2018, for 2,000 people, transition started when they were at school for them. But there was no support for them. There was nowhere to go. Gendered intelligence is a fantastic hub of not just knowledge and hope, but future. It will create a different sense of wanting to live in the world. And we need to think about what our education system is actually educating. When we look maybe around us, I don't think ever, I mean, I thought the 80s was bad, but the hatred, the contempt that is shown for human beings, I feel totally, I cannot believe that somebody would say they hate another human being because of how they wish to live in the world. It's totally abhorrent, but that is about education. And it's not about ramming education into the heads of people. It's about pedagogy. It's about knowledge. It's about the experiential. It's about stories, and it's about learning about how we understand each other as people. And that idea of intersectionality. When I teach sociology students, I've just run the first course in trans and non-binary. It's called Beyond the Binary in a very exciting way. Beyond the Binary over at Warwick. You could consider that to be a neoliberal institution, of which it is. But the idea that for the first time I've been allowed to go and teach students about non-binary questions that they've wanted to ask themselves. I had a class of 30 odd people who one by one began to question, to the point where we were sharing stories about what was happening in Hungary, what was happening in parts of Southeast Asia, people were coming out about their own gender identity. Education is such an important cog in this whole way of moving things along. Within the healthcare sector, as a psychologist, I am pretty much appalled, and I do think that Labour and you know, the women and the Women's Committee and Women and Equalities Committee, we do need to really venture. We just had a massive, I mean, look, there were loads of us who were going along last year to discuss findings to the Women and Equalities Committee about trans issues. I mean, I've got a stack of information from that committee. It's fantastic, but it's no good leaving it on pieces of paper. We in our community, we need to know what's happening. We need to be able to speak with each other like this and understand what's really going on. When I work with psychologists, and I've been in gender identity clinics, and I've interviewed people who are psychologists working in gender identity clinics, I was actually quite horrified by the fact that no research is being done. It has been done on the impact of hormones being only given to people quite late on in the day, or just the impact of hormones. There's nothing been done about researching people's use or access to hormones outside of prescribing. There's lots of research that needs to be done that will help our community to have a better healthcare system. And it's not really much good. It's not really just about funding, that we say, oh, well, you know, there's so many people want to use the clinics. It's almost a deliberate strategy. We really must start knocking on the door of the government, Labour as well. We need to sort of go there and start writing to MPs, going into our CLPs and finding out why these delays are happening. There's thousands of people who are not receiving treatment. If this was any condition at all that was being recognised as so highly dangerous in the sense that it's killing people, we can see from coronavirus, there are ways to fund healthcare. I am not prepared to stand back and watch my community die. It's not going to happen, not again. I watched this in the 80s. I watched people die because of the government's lack of strategy, and it's happening again. It is not about money. It's about wanting to do something. It's about allowing my friends who are living in virtual poverty, can't get a job, can't bloody well get anywhere to live. It's rubbing your hands like that and saying, oh, well, it's about money. No, it is not about money. It's about strategy. And it's about allowing my people to die. It is not good enough. It cannot go on. I'm now at an age where I've already seen all this. You don't want to be seeing all this for another 20 or 30 years. It's unacceptable. So when we go around, and I won't go on because I've got a whole list of things we need to do. We need to make hormones available. We need to actually make sure that clinics change the actual shape of them. Even the 3 that have been set up as trials, we need new approaches. An NHS commissioner at a meeting that I was at laughed when he said, informed consent? You'll never get informed consent while I'm a commissioner. What on earth does that mean? What power is that to speak about a group of people that are vulnerable? It is not acceptable. And finally, GPs. I know they're under immense pressure. I understand that. But the government stated quite clearly that they can allow people to have access, they can give them bridging hormones, then do it. On the MOU, we're working with the Royal College of GPs. We've got the NHS England on board. We need to find out why GPs are not actually giving bridging hormones to the people in the trans community who need them. We need a different system. I'm of an age, as I've just said, I've seen this, I've heard all these arguments. If we want to do something, we can do it. We need to mobilize. Don't accept no. That's what I would say. You know, we used to have a badge, silence equals death. And that is still the same today. And I just think all these voices that we have heard tonight, all the people listening, thank you. I just think that we need voices out there. We are, I always say, I used to say this, that to live in safety is our freedom. And to have our freedom is the greatest form of equality we can have. And that's it. That's all I want to say. I finished.
Wow, thank you so much, Eve. That was an unbelievably powerful note to end on. And yeah, there were some just really amazingly clearly articulated political demands there, and I'm sure we can all get behind, and so much rage as well. So thanks for sharing that. And yeah, a big shout out to your mum as well.
Yeah, good. I'll tell her.
So I'd love to meet her. She sounds like a legend.
Great.
Cool. Thanks for joining us. Right, that's nearly all we have time for this evening. Thank you once again to all the speakers for joining us. This event has been recorded and we're going to be uploading it to the Resource Hub section of the World Transforms website, along with all the other events that we're putting on in the programme and the trainings and the resources. We're going to post a link to the Resource Hub right now so you can see where they will be. I hope you found this evening useful and inspiring. We've covered lots of different aspects of the trans experience, and I would encourage everyone to follow up with the different organisations represented on this call this evening and find out more about how you can support them. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. Just to say one more time, if you want to support us to build more trans political education like this, then drop us a line on transpoliticaleducation@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back for another event in December, so please do look out for that. We'll be advertising it to TWT Momentum and Labour Campaign for Trans Rights mailing lists, as well as on social media. So if you're not on any of those lists or on the socials, then do just drop us a line on the email I just mentioned, and we can link you in. But thank you again so much to everyone, solidarity, and see you soon.